Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be understanding and dealing with the concept of order closure. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand what do we mean by or how do we define the concept order closure, explain the process of closing an order in an operations or management, and what are the various activities that needs to be listed down for the order closure components. Now first understand what do we mean by the order closure. The order closure is a certain series or the activities that have been undertaken by a service manager which allows him to close a certain order or the job or the task that has been undertaken in the organization. So closing an order with the open line items on the other hand cancels the open line items. Now in a particular case, when we have raised a certain job shop or a job card has been issued, based on the job shop or the flow shop activity that has been undertaken in the organization, certain series of activities are being undertaken. And when those series of activities are being completed at a certain stage, that is within the specified or the designated time period, and the product is ready to be delivered and accordingly the service activity is being completed, then at this particular stage the order needs to be closed. So after the compilation of all those activities, and whenever we have to find and whenever we see that all the activities have been complied as per the need and requirement, when or the goods or the service or the processing activity is been completed, one has to close the order. In most of the cases, it has been observed that closing all the orders in the assembly line is essentially important. And before closing all the orders, one has to also assess and verify that all the orders that we are closing are completely done very effectively and accordingly the results are being generated or calculated or not. And hence, arriving at a certain conclusion for the completion of the task or activity is essentially important. And hence, when all the line items are closed, service manager must immediately close the order. So when the particular task or a particular job or a particular activity is been completed, it is necessary to see that all those activities or the orders have been completed and they are also been closed. Now let's understand how do we process the closure of a certain order. First thing, the initially one has to see that the request management or the request has been generated to the management and in the consideration about how do we close a particular order. So now in a particular software, we have to follow the various steps. So that particular software, that is wherein we have the order closure perspectives, first thing that one need to do is click on the request management. After clicking on the request management, the another tab that has been opened is order or the search order. So based on the orders that we have been placed, we have to search which order we want to close. So accordingly, there may be several types of orders that can be going on, or it may be on an ongoing process in a certain organization. So out of those particular order, if one of the task or the job is been completed, then we have to search and find out those particular tasks and accordingly again click or press enter on the order that is been searched. After clicking search to generate a record list. So again a record list will be shown for you about which activities have been conducted, which activities are into process and which activities have been completed. So by clicking move or the more actions icon and then selecting the line item. So a particular job shop or a particular order may have one single activity or several number of activities, that is called a line activity. So in this particular case, the action has to be initiated and it has to be taken that whether we want to close the entire line or whether we want to close the entire job. So a single line of activity can also be closed or an entire job activity can also be closed, and hence the order closure procedure, order close procedure can be related with the closure of a certain order or a closure of a certain line. Then next we have to see is you have to tap on take action and accordingly the order needs to be closed. So such activities are being undertaken in the software that is being used in the organizations. Now let's understand what are the various terminologies that have been used in the order closure. The first terminology that has been used is tracking the receiving. So whatever amount or whatever quantity or whatever the goods and the orders that we are receiving, one has to track all those particular activities. So when I say order, the order management software specifically deals with how do we track a particular order. And in a particular tracking system, one can easily identify and see about what is the job shop or the activity that has been going on, for how long it has been going, and what is the projected time for its completion. Based on its time for completion, one can come to a conclusion that further what amount of time will be required and when the activity will be completed. Management of maintenance, supporting files and models. So here in this case, If any maintenance activity or the supporting activity is needed to be undertaken, then those particular information also needs to be provided, and it also needs to be checked about what is the stage of the order. Then one has to consider the concept of closing the line item. So if any line item has been completed, then accordingly one has to always close the assembly line also. So in a sequence, there may be a sequence or a series of activities wherein you can close a individual line also, or you can go ahead and directly close the order if the order is been completed, and that's the concern of order closure. And lastly, saving the entire data, that is, you have to save whatever data that has been inserted and accordingly exit from the respective software. So whatever software or the data management system is into existence, all the data before exiting or before closing needs to be saved, and then one has to exit from the system. Now let's understand what is the life cycle of the order closure. For the life cycle of the order closure first starts with the beginning consideration of when do we have planned or whenever we have opened a certain order closure, that is initiating the process group up. Now when we say that process group is been implemented, whatever series of activity that we have planned or whatever assembly line activity is into existence, we have to first initiate and see that whether all those activities are been there in a proper sequence or not. Then planning the process group. For a planning of a process group, one has to also see that in what way or in what series the activities are either been conducted or either they have been completed, and hence planning of series of activities is essentially important. Executing the process group. In terms of executing the process group, it is essential to need and it is necessary to see that how do we execute those process activities and in what way those activities can be completed. For execution of a certain concern, if the activity is been completed within the specified time period, then those particular activities should be closed down accordingly, and certain new task or the new job should be assigned to the business organization. And hence execution process with respect to the either the continuation of a certain order or completion of a certain order needs to be undertaken and decided accordingly. Monitoring and controlling the process group. So one has to monitor, one has to control and see that all those activities that have been conducted are being monitored, they have been controlled in a very effective way, and accordingly those activities are being regulated in a proper flow up. And lastly, closing the process group. So once all the activities have been completed, the process or activity needs to be closed down, and accordingly the process group needs to be closed. Now let's understand what is the project closure. How does the project closure helps avoid the certain considerations? So the failure to identify the team for a person who will own and manage the solution will lead to a final delivery. So one has to identify that who will be the team or who will the person who will be considered as the responsible for conducting a business transaction and how the final delivery will be completed, making the same mistakes on future projects and objectives. So for an order closure to be very effective, such a certain mistake that needs to be avoided is we need to understand and evaluate what are the future projects that can be undertaken, what are the objectives of those particular projects, and how to avoid those projects that are needed to be undertaken in business organization. So as a resultant of this, if there is a certain consideration as to late payment, as to contracts, as to deliveries, and as to liability, then certain risk needs to be avoided, and accordingly the planning of series of activities needs to be undertaken. And lastly, finalization of the goods or deliverables without the dedicated support and resources. And hence, for those considerations, one has to come to a certain conclusion about how those resources and activities can be complied, and one has to see that those particular resources should be utilized in a very effective way, and after the composition of the resources, the order needs to be completed in the specified time period. Now let's understand how the project closure helps to ensure that the order is being completed and it needs to be closed down. So when all the work that has been assigned, it has been accomplished, and one has been ensured or it has been confirmed that the activities have been completed in accordance with the project, one has to go for an order closure. Accordingly, after the completion of a certain order, the project also can be entirely closed. So the entire project management procedure has been completed, and when all the final project activities have been completed, they must go for a final permission, and accordingly the sign off for a certain project needs to be undertaken. The project management closure process also allows the team to assess and evaluate the project performance in order to ensure the success of a future projects. And hence, in those particular consideration, the project management or a team management activity is essentially important, which helps to identify or deal with how those activities can be completed in a specified time period, and after the successful completion of a particular project, the entire project also needs to be closed. Now let's understand what are the various 7 steps in the order closure. Number 1 is the formally transfer of all deliverables, confirming the project completion, reviewing all the contracts and the documentation, releasing of the resources, the conduct of a postmortem, the archiving of the documentation, and lastly, celebration. So here in this case, all the activities or all the deliverables, that is warehouse and so on, it needs to be complied, and accordingly all the books of accounts or the department needs to be closed. Confirming the project completion. So accordingly, various documents or various projects needs to be prepared, and accordingly the completion report should be prepared by the respective departments. Reviewing of all those particular documentation and the contracts that have been there with the existing customers or the clients and the vendors needs to be assessed or reviewed at a one stage, and accordingly the order closure decision needs to be undertaken. Then after a stage, when if any amount of resources are available, certain release of those resources should be undertaken, and accordingly the resource identification or allocation needs to be identified. Conducting a postmortem, in which analysis of the ideas, analysis of the transaction that have been undertaken, it should be assessed in a better way, and accordingly such transaction should be completed as and when it has been required. And lastly, archiving the documentation and celebration. So when all these steps have been confirmed, it has been proved that the activities have been completed, then at this particular stage you have to archive all the documentation, and the last step remains is the celebration. Now, what is the team consideration or the part of a team consideration question, wherein you can understand that what particularly went well. And now here in this case, one has to understand that we have to answer the several questions, that why do we need to come to a conclusion as to either the project completion or the order completion. That is, when the order or the project is been closed, then what are the various consideration as to the question that needs to be answered. That is, what went particularly well, that if all the activities have been completed in a very effective way, or if it does not go in a perfect way, then what are the various series or activities in which the activity was been done effectively and the activity was not been done effectively. What were the difficulties or the setbacks that was been identified. So any problems that have been identified, any problems that have been set, or any difficulty that was been identified or that was been observed, all those things needs to be taken into account, into consideration, and then such results needs to be completed. The communication between the team, the management of team resources and so on also needs to be identified, and a liable decision needs to be undertaken. Click more on the more options icon and select the line item. So if at any stage any activity is been pending, then accordingly the more actions or the tabs needs to be preferred in the order management software, and accordingly all the orders needs to be closed. Findings and satisfactory to the client. So whatever findings was associated with the business organization, all those findings needs to be assessed, needs to be identified, and accordingly a satisfactory report with respect to the client or the customers needs to be completed. And lastly, engaging other future course of action. So if any future initiatives are needed to be undertaken, then what changes or what improvements needs to be completed, what needs to be organized, and so on, and all those activities needs to be completed. So here in this case, one has to understand that when we end a certain project, in order to boost the morale of a certain employees or be boost the morale of your team, opportunity to all the people needs to be identified, it should be given, and accordingly series of activities should be completed in a specified time period. And hence order closure procedure focuses on the concept of producing the unit which is beneficial for the industry in the years to come. So once all the paperwork is been completed and all the reviews or the activities have been taken into account, then a successful closure of the activity or a task or a particular project can be undertaken. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what do we mean by the order closure, what are the various planning activities that have been required for an order closure, and lastly, how do we implement the order closure process in the organization. Along with, we have also seen after the completion of the order closure, how do we complete the process or activities of the project closure. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning at this particular stage. Thank you so much for your patience listening. Thank you.